The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at the corner of Main and Fifth, its diesel engine coughing black smoke into the crisp October air of Millbrook, Nebraska. Jake Morrison shouldered his worn duffel bag and stepped down onto the cracked concrete, his combat boots making hollow sounds that seemed to echo in the empty street. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days since he'd last stood on this corner. Not that he was counting. The town looked smaller than he remembered, if that was even possible. Millbrook had never been much, population 3,847 according to the faded welcome sign, but now it felt like a miniature version of itself, as if someone had taken his memories and shrunk them down. The same weathered storefronts lined Main Street, Peterson's Hardware with its paint peeling like old skin, the Sunrise Diner with its flickering neon sign, and Murphy's Bar with its windows so dark you couldn't tell if it was open or closed. Jake pulled his baseball cap lower over his eyes, hoping to avoid the curious stares that small towns specialized in. He'd changed more than the town had shrunk. 27 years old, and he felt ancient, carrying weight that had nothing to do with the 60-pound pack he'd humped through the mountains of Afghanistan. His left leg bore a scar from Kandahar, a souvenir from an IED that had turned his Humvee into twisted metal and ended his third tour 6 months early, but the real wounds were the ones nobody could see. The walk to his childhood home took 15 minutes, past the elementary school where he'd learned to read, past the football field where he'd scored the winning touchdown senior year, past all the landmarks of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. His mother's house sat at the end of Elm Street, a 2-story colonial with blue shutters and a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. The same American flag hung from the same pole, though it looked newer. Probably replaced it when he deployed. Susan Morrison was waiting at the front door before he'd even reached the front steps, as if she'd been watching from the window. She was smaller than he remembered too, her brown hair now streaked with silver, worry lines etched around her eyes that hadn't been there when he left. "Jake." She said his name like a prayer answered, her voice thick with emotion she was trying to control. They embraced on the porch, and Jake felt her shoulders shake with silent tears. He held her carefully, as if she might break, conscious of how his body had hardened into something designed for violence and survival. "I made your room up," she said when they finally separated, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Same as you left it. Well, mostly. I had to box up some things to make room for the medical supplies." "Medical supplies?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "From when your father—" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "We'll talk about that later. You must be hungry. I've got pot roast in the slow cooker." Jake followed her inside, breathing in the familiar scents of home. Lemon furniture polish, the faint smell of his mother's perfume, something baking in the kitchen. The living room was exactly as he'd left it, down to the family photos on the mantel and his high school football trophies on the bookshelf. But there was something different too. Medical equipment scattered around like unwelcome guests, a wheelchair folded in the corner, pill bottles lined up on the coffee table like tiny soldiers. "Mom," Jake set down his duffel bag and turned to face her. "What's going on with Dad?" Susan Morrison's composure finally cracked. She sank into her favorite armchair, the same floral pattern she'd had for 20 years, and buried her face in her hands. "He's sick, Jake. Really sick. The doctors say it's ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He's been fighting it for 8 months now, but he's getting worse." The words hit Jake like incoming mortar fire. He stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his mind struggling to process this new reality. His father, Tom Morrison, had always been larger than life, a construction foreman who could lift steel beams and intimidate grown men with just a look. The idea of that same man wasting away from disease seemed impossible. "Where is he now?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse. "Upstairs resting. The medication makes him tired. Jake, I didn't want to tell you over the phone while you were deployed. I didn't want you to worry, to get distracted and—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. Get distracted and end up dead. How bad? The question came out flat, clinical. Jake recognized the tone. It was how he'd asked about casualty reports, about mission parameters, about things too painful to approach with normal human emotion. "Bad," Susan whispered. "He can still walk some, but his hands shake. His speech is getting slurred. The doctor says we've got maybe a year, possibly 2 if we're lucky." She looked up at her son with desperate eyes. "I've been taking care of him, but Jake, I don't know how much longer I can do this alone. The medical bills, the equipment, trying to keep up with everything he needs." Jake knelt beside his mother's chair, and took her hands in his. They felt fragile, like bird bones. "You're not alone anymore, Mom. I'm here now." But even as he said the words, Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the sensation of walls closing in. He'd come home seeking peace, hoping to find some version of the life he'd left behind. Instead, he'd walked into another battlefield, one where the enemy was time and disease and the slow, inevitable march toward loss. He'd thought he was done fighting, but apparently the war had just changed venues. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the scent of dying leaves and the promise of a long, hard winter ahead. 3 days later, Jake sat in the sterile waiting room of the Millbrook Medical Center, filling out forms that asked questions he didn't want to answer. The VA had scheduled him for a routine checkup, part of the standard post-deployment medical screening that all returning veterans were required to complete. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, institutional glow that reminded him uncomfortably of the field hospitals he'd worked in overseas. He'd spent the past 72 hours settling into a routine that felt anything but routine. Mornings were for helping his father with basic tasks that Tom Morrison attacked with stubborn determination, getting dressed, shaving, walking to the kitchen table for breakfast. Afternoons were for watching his mother pretend that everything was normal while she organized pill schedules and researched ALS treatments on their ancient desktop computer. Evenings were for lying awake in his childhood bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house settle around him. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of Kandahar, the same images cycling through his mind like a broken projector, dust and blood, and the sound of his squad leader, Sergeant Rodriguez, screaming for a medic. Jake would wake with his heart pounding, sheets soaked in sweat, the phantom taste of cordite in his mouth. Jake Morrison. A nurse appeared at the waiting room door, clipboard in hand. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and practical shoes, the sort of woman who'd probably been taking care of people her entire life. Jake followed her down a hallway lined with motivational posters and health advisory notices. The exam room was small and windowless, containing the usual medical furniture, examination table, blood pressure cuff, a computer terminal where his life would be reduced to data points and diagnostic codes. "The doctor will be with you shortly," the nurse said, taking his vital signs with efficient professionalism. "How are you adjusting to being home?" "Fine," Jake lied, the same automatic response he'd given to every variation of that question over the past week. "Fine. Everything's fine." "So I'm fine." Dr. Sarah Chen entered the room 15 minutes later, a woman in her early 40s with short black hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen enough returning veterans to recognize the signs. She reviewed his chart on the computer screen, scrolling through pages of military medical records that documented 3 tours, 2 Purple Hearts, and a collection of minor injuries that added up to a body that was 27 going on 50. "How's the leg?" she asked, referring to the shrapnel wound that had earned him his ticket home. "Good. No pain." Another lie, but this one was easier to tell. Physical pain was simple, manageable. It was the other kind that kept him awake at night. Dr. Chen made notes, asked the standard questions about sleep patterns and alcohol consumption and thoughts of self-harm. Jake gave the standard answers, the ones that would get him through the appointment without triggering any red flags or mandatory psychiatric holds. He'd learned the script in military hospitals overseas. "I see here that you served as a combat medic," Dr. Chen said, looking up from her screen. "That must have been challenging." "Part of the job," Jake replied, his voice carefully neutral. "What kind of training did you receive? I'm curious because I don't see a lot of detailed medical training in most infantry records." Jake hesitated. This was the part of his service record that always raised eyebrows, the part that didn't fit neatly into standard military categories. Standard combat lifesaver course, plus some additional training. "Additional training?" Dr. Chen's tone sharpened slightly, professional interest engaged. "What kind of additional training?" "Field surgery, trauma medicine, emergency procedures." Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't like talking about this part, didn't like the way people looked at him when they understood what his hands had done in those makeshift operating rooms. Dr. Chen set down her pen and leaned forward. "Jake, I need you to be more specific. Your records indicate you spent 6 months at the Army Medical Department Center and School. That's not standard combat medic training, that's intensive medical education. What exactly were you qualified to do?" The question hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Jake stared at his hands, remembering the weight of surgical instruments, the desperate race against time and blood loss, the impossible decisions made in the space between heartbeats. He remembered Rodriguez, gut-shot and dying, begging Jake to save him. He remembered the field amputation he'd performed on a 19-year-old private from Ohio, working by flashlight, while mortars fell around them. He remembered the ones he'd saved, and the ones he couldn't, and how the line between life and death had sometimes come down to nothing more than his ability to keep his hands steady while the world exploded around him. "I was qualified to perform emergency surgery," Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trauma surgery, in the field." When there was no one else, Dr. Chen's eyes widened slightly. She pulled up another screen on her computer, scrolling through pages of certifications and training records that painted a picture of a combat medic who'd been trained to function as a battlefield surgeon. "Jake, this is extraordinary. According to this, you were essentially operating as a trauma surgeon in combat conditions. The level of training here..." She trailed off, then looked at him with new understanding. "How many lives did you save?" Jake closed his eyes, seeing faces in the darkness behind his eyelids. Rodriguez, who died despite everything Jake had tried. Private Chen, no relation to the doctor, who'd lived because Jake had managed to repair a severed artery with nothing but field equipment and determination. Sergeant Williams, who'd walked away from an IED blast that should have killed him because Jake had performed an emergency tracheotomy in the back of a moving Humvee. "I don't know," he said. "I stopped counting." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Dr. Chen studied Jake's face, recognizing something in his expression that went beyond standard combat trauma. This wasn't just a soldier dealing with the aftermath of war. This was a healer carrying the weight of every life that had passed through his hands. "Jake," she said gently, "with your training and experience, have you considered that there might be ways to use those skills here at home? Our emergency department could always use someone with your background." Jake's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since the appointment began. "I'm not a doctor." "No," Dr. Chen agreed, "but you're something almost as valuable. You're someone who's learned to save lives under the worst possible conditions. That's not a skill that just disappears because you've changed locations." Outside the medical center, Jake sat in his mother's car in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to process what had just happened. For 3 years, he'd been running from what he'd done overseas, trying to bury the memories and the skills that came with them. Now, suddenly, someone was suggesting he'd been running in the wrong direction. The weight of possibility settled on his shoulders like a familiar pack, heavy but not unwelcome. Maybe there was a way to make the nightmares mean something. Maybe there was a way to turn the darkest chapter of his life into something that could bring light to others. But first he had to get through today and tomorrow, and all the days that would follow, carrying the burden of what he'd learned about life and death in the mountains of Afghanistan. Jake started the car and headed home, where his father was waiting for help with lunch and his mother was pretending that everything was going to be okay. He had a family to take care of now, and maybe, just maybe, he had found a way to do what he'd always done best: save the people who needed saving, one life at a time. Jake had been home for exactly 1 week when the call came. It was Thursday evening, October rain drumming against the windows, while he helped his father work through physical therapy exercises that were supposed to slow the progression of the ALS. Tom Morrison's hands shook as he tried to grip the rubber ball, his frustration evident in the tight line of his jaw. "Damn thing," Tom muttered, his words slightly slurred. The disease had begun affecting his speech, turning the commanding voice Jake remembered into something hesitant and uncertain. "Take your time, Dad," Jake said, demonstrating the exercise again. "It's not a race." The phone rang just as Tom managed to squeeze the ball successfully. Susan answered it in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the house with the practiced cheerfulness she used for telemarketers and church committee members. But Jake heard the change in her tone, the shift from polite to concerned to urgent. "Jake," she called out, her voice tight with worry. "It's Mrs. Henderson from down the street. There's been an accident at the Morrison farm. No relation," she added quickly, seeing his expression. "She needs someone with medical training. The ambulance is 20 minutes out." Jake was already moving before she finished speaking, muscle memory taking over. "Where?" "The old Morrison place, about 3 miles north on County Road 12. A piece of farm equipment overturned, 2 people trapped. Jake grabbed his jacket and keys, his mind automatically shifting into the clinical detachment he'd learned in combat zones. Distance from emotion meant clarity of thought, and clarity of thought meant the difference between life and death. Tell them I'm coming. Call 911 and make sure they know someone with medical training is en route. The drive to the accident site took 7 minutes of white-knuckle navigation down rain-slicked country roads. Jake's headlights cut through the October darkness, illuminating stretches of harvested cornfields and the occasional farmhouse. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his heart hammered against his ribs with a rhythm he recognized from patrol missions in Afghanistan. The Morrison farm, coincidentally sharing his surname but no relation to his family, sprawled across 200 acres of Nebraska farmland. Jake could see the accident before he even pulled into the driveway. An overturned tractor with a bush hog attachment, emergency flares casting everything in hellish red light, and 3 figures huddled around what appeared to be 2 victims trapped beneath the machinery. Frank Morrison, the farm owner, ran toward Jake's car before he'd even killed the engine. "Thank God you're here," Frank said, his face pale with shock and streaked with mud. "It's my son Danny and his friend Mike. The tractor rolled when they hit that ditch. We can't get them out, and Danny—" Frank's voice broke. "Danny's bleeding real bad." Jake grabbed the medical kit he'd assembled from his mother's supplies, basic first aid materials that would have to do until the paramedics arrived. He followed Frank toward the overturned tractor, his trained eyes already assessing the scene. The massive piece of farm equipment had rolled onto its side in a drainage ditch, pinning both victims underneath. One boy, Mike, according to Frank, was conscious and talking, which was a good sign. The other, Danny, was trapped more completely under the engine block, and Jake could see the dark stain of blood spreading in the mud around him. "How long have they been trapped?" Jake asked, dropping to his knees beside Danny Morrison. The boy was maybe 17, with sandy hair matted with blood, and a face that was too pale in the harsh glare of the emergency flares. 15 minutes, maybe 20, Frank replied. "We called 911 right away, but you know how it is out here. Ambulance has to come from town." Jake's hands moved automatically, checking for pulse and breathing while his eyes assessed the visible injuries. Danny's breathing was shallow and rapid, signs of shock and possible internal bleeding. A deep gash across his forehead was bleeding freely, and his left leg was pinned at an unnatural angle beneath the tractor's engine. "Danny, can you hear me?" Jake's voice was calm, authoritative. "My name is Jake. I'm here to help you." The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "It hurts," he whispered. "It hurts real bad." "I know," Jake replied, his hands continuing their assessment. "I'm going to take care of you, but I need you to stay awake and talk to me. Can you do that?" Jake's mind raced through possibilities and procedures, falling back on training that had kept him alive and kept his patients breathing in circumstances far worse than this. The head wound needed immediate attention to control bleeding. The leg appeared to be fractured, possibly compound, but it was the rapid pulse and falling blood pressure that concerned him most. Signs of internal bleeding that would require more intervention than basic first aid. "Frank, I need you to get me every clean towel or sheet you can find," Jake ordered, applying direct pressure to Danny's head wound. "And get me a strong flashlight. I need to see what we're working with here." The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of controlled emergency medicine. Jake managed to stop the bleeding from Danny's head wound and stabilize his neck in case of spinal injury. Mike, the other victim, had a dislocated shoulder and possible concussion, but was in much better condition. The challenge was keeping both boys stable and conscious while they waited for proper equipment to lift the tractor. "How do you know how to do all this?" Frank asked, watching Jake work with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before under much worse conditions. "Military," Jake replied, not taking his eyes off Danny's vitals. "Combat medic, 3 tours in Afghanistan." "Jesus," Frank breathed. "We got lucky you were here." Lucky. Jake had heard that word applied to his presence before, usually from soldiers who'd survived because he'd been there with the right training at the right time. But luck felt like the wrong word when you carried the weight of everyone you hadn't been able to save. The sound of sirens finally cut through the night, growing louder as the ambulance and fire truck turned into the farm driveway. Jake felt some of the tension leave his shoulders as trained paramedics took over, but he stayed close, briefing them on the victim's conditions and the treatment he'd provided. "Damn fine work," said Tom Bradley, the lead paramedic, after Jake had given him a complete rundown of both patients' status. "You probably saved this kid's life, That head wound would have bled him out if you hadn't gotten here when you did. Jake watched as they loaded Danny Morrison into the ambulance, the boy now stable and conscious, thanks to the emergency treatment he'd received. Mike was loaded into a second ambulance with less urgency, his injuries serious, but not life-threatening. As the ambulances pulled away, their red lights disappearing into the darkness, Frank Morrison grabbed Jake's hand in both of his. "I don't know how to thank you," the farmer said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Danny's my only son. If you hadn't been here—" "He's going to be okay," Jake replied, meaning it. "The paramedics will take good care of him at the hospital." The drive home was quiet, Jake's hands finally beginning to shake now that the emergency was over. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the familiar mixture of exhaustion and hypervigilance that always followed high-stress medical situations. But there was something else too, something he hadn't felt in a long time, the satisfaction of using his skills to help someone, of making a difference when it mattered most. His mother was waiting up when he got home, worry etched in every line of her face. "How are they?" she asked immediately. "They're going to be fine," Jake said, sinking into the kitchen chair. "Both of them." Susan poured him a cup of coffee and sat across from him at the table where he'd eaten breakfast as a child. "Frank Morrison called while you were gone. He wanted me to know that the doctors said you saved his son's life. They said if Danny had bled for another 10 minutes, he wouldn't have made it." Jake stared into his coffee cup, processing the words. Another life saved. Another name to add to the list of people who'd lived because he'd been there with the right training at the right time. It should have felt good, and part of it did. But it also felt like a weight. Another person whose survival was now connected to his own story. "Mom," he said finally, "Dr. Chen mentioned that the hospital emergency department might need someone with my background." Susan Morrison studied her son's face in the soft kitchen light, seeing something there that gave her hope for the first time since he'd come home. "What are you thinking, Jake?" "I'm thinking maybe it's time to stop running from what I know how to do." The next morning brought news that would change everything. Jake woke to the sound of his phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand, a sound that still made his heart race, programmed as he was to expect emergency communications. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was familiar. "Jake, this is Dr. Chen from the medical center. I hope I'm not calling too early, but I heard about what happened at the Morrison farm last night." Jake rubbed his eyes and checked the clock. 7:30 a.m. News travels fast in a small town. "Tom Bradley is a friend of mine," Dr. Chen explained. "He told me about the emergency treatment you provided. Jake, what you did out there, stabilizing 2 trauma victims with basic supplies in the dark, that's the kind of skill set we desperately need here." Jake sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "Dr. Chen, I appreciate the call, but please let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and after hearing about last night, I have a proposition for you. Would you be willing to meet with me and our emergency department chief? We have a position opening up that might be perfect for your background." An hour later, Jake found himself back at the medical center, this time in Dr. Chen's office on the 3rd floor. The room was small but comfortable, filled with medical journals and family photos that spoke of a life dedicated to healing. Joining them was Dr. Michael Torres, the emergency department chief, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of calm demeanor that came from decades of managing medical crises. "Jake, I've reviewed your military medical records," Dr. Torres began, settling into a chair across from Jake's. "Your training and experience are remarkable. 6 months of intensive trauma surgery education, 3 combat tours as a forward surgical team medic, and according to Tom Bradley's report, you just saved a young man's life using nothing but basic supplies and field experience." "I did what anyone with my training would do," Jake replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "That's exactly the attitude we need," Dr. Chen interjected. "Jake, we want to offer you a position as a trauma specialist in our emergency department. You wouldn't be practicing as a physician. We understand you don't have medical school credentials, but you would be working alongside our doctors as a highly skilled medical technician specializing in trauma cases." Jake felt his chest tighten. "I'm not sure I understand." Dr. Torres leaned forward. "Let me explain. Rural hospitals like ours face unique challenges. We're often the first and only medical facility within an hour's drive for trauma cases. When someone comes in with serious injuries, car accidents, farm equipment incidents, industrial accidents, we need people who can think and act quickly while we're assessing and stabilizing." Your combat experience gives you something we can't teach in civilian medical programs, Dr. Chen added. You've learned to make life or death decisions under extreme pressure. You've performed complex medical procedures in conditions that would paralyze most people. That's invaluable experience. Jake stared at his hands, remembering the weight of surgical instruments, the controlled chaos of a field hospital, the impossible choices that had to be made in seconds. The things I did overseas, they weren't always by the book. Sometimes you don't have time for proper protocols. That's exactly what makes you valuable, Dr. Torres said. Medicine isn't always about following textbook procedures. Sometimes it's about adapting, improvising, doing whatever it takes to keep someone alive long enough to get them proper care. You've already proven you can do that. The conversation continued for another hour, covering details about certification requirements, training programs, and the specific responsibilities the position would entail. Jake would need to complete civilian emergency medical technician certification, but his military credentials would expedite the process significantly. The hospital would provide additional training on their equipment and protocols, but the foundation was already there. There's one more thing, Dr. Torres said as the meeting was winding down. We're not just offering you a job, Jake. We're offering you a chance to continue doing what you've always done, saving lives. The only difference is the uniform and the location. After leaving the medical center, Jake drove aimlessly through Millbrook's quiet streets, processing everything he'd heard. The offer was generous, better pay than he'd expected, comprehensive benefits, and the opportunity to use skills he'd thought he'd never need again. But it also meant stepping back into a world where people's lives depended on his decisions, where a moment's hesitation or a single mistake could mean the difference between a family celebrating or mourning. He found himself parked outside Millbrook High School, watching students walk between buildings during their lunch break. These kids were the same age as some of the soldiers he'd treated in Afghanistan, young and invincible, until the moment they weren't. The thought of potentially treating injured teenagers, of seeing that same vulnerability in a civilian context, made his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Jake's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was his mother. "Jake, your father wants to talk to you when you get home," Susan said. "He's having a good day today. His speech is clearer and he seems stronger. I think he has something important to say." 20 minutes later, Jake sat beside his father's recliner in the living room, noting how Tom Morrison seemed to have shrunk even in the past week. The disease was relentless in its progression, stealing pieces of the man Jake had always seen as unbreakable. "Son," Tom began, his words careful but clear, "your mother told me about the job offer at the hospital." "Dad, I haven't decided anything yet." Tom held up a shaking hand. "Let me say this while I can say it clearly." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I was your age, I thought strength meant carrying everything alone, thought asking for help was weakness, thought admitting you needed something meant you weren't man enough to handle life." Jake waited, recognizing the careful way his father was forming each word. "This disease has taught me different," Tom continued. "Strength isn't about carrying everything alone. It's about knowing when to use the gifts you've been given to help others, even when it's hard, even when it scares you." The older man reached out with a trembling hand and grasped Jake's arm. "You've got a gift, son. What you can do with your hands, the knowledge you carry, that's not something to run from. That's something to use." "Dad, what if I can't handle it? What if I freeze up or make a mistake or—" "Then you'll be human," Tom interrupted, his voice gaining strength. "But you'll be a human who tried to help instead of a human who ran away from his purpose." He leaned back in his chair, exhausted by the effort of the conversation. "I'm proud of you, Jake, for what you did in the service, for what you did last night, and for whatever you decide to do next. But I think you already know what the right choice is." That evening, Jake stood on the front porch, looking out at the quiet street where he'd learned to ride a bicycle and play catch and all the other rituals of small-town childhood. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the maple trees lining Elm Street had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. Inside the house, his mother was helping his father with his evening medications, a routine that would only become more complex as the disease progressed. They would need him here, need his help managing the difficult months ahead, but they would also need the income a steady job could provide, and the sense of purpose that came from using his skills to help others. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed Dr. Chen's number. "Dr. Chen, it's Jake Morrison," he said when she answered. "I've been thinking about your offer and I'd like to accept the position. When can I start?" Jake's first day at Millbrook Medical Center began at 6 a.m. with a knot in his stomach. that felt disturbingly familiar. It was the same anxious tension he'd experienced before his first combat patrol, the weight of knowing that lives might depend on decisions he hadn't made yet. He stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue scrubs that felt foreign after years of military uniforms and civilian clothes. "You look professional," his mother said from the doorway, holding a travel mug of coffee. Susan Morrison had been up since 5:30, making breakfast and fussing over details the way she had when Jake started kindergarten. Some maternal instincts, apparently, never faded. "I feel like I'm playing dress-up," Jake admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The scrubs fit well enough, but they felt like a costume, someone else's idea of who he was supposed to be. "Your father wanted me to give you this," Susan said, holding out a small object. It was Tom Morrison's old pocket watch, a silver Timex that had belonged to Jake's grandfather. He said, "Every man needs to know what time it is when it matters most." Jake turned the watch over in his hands, feeling its familiar weight. His grandfather had carried it through World War II, his father through 30 years of construction work, and now it was his. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Generations of Morrison men, each finding their own way to serve and protect. The drive to the hospital took 12 minutes through Millbrook's awakening streets. Jake passed the elementary school, where a few early teachers were arriving, the post office where mail trucks were loading for rural routes, and the Sunrise Diner, where farmers were already gathering for coffee and gossip about grain prices and weather forecasts. This was the community he would be serving now, people he'd grown up with, and people who'd watched him leave as a boy and return as something harder to define. Dr. Torres met him at the emergency department entrance, looking surprisingly alert for someone who'd probably been on call all night. "Ready for orientation?" he asked, leading Jake through a maze of corridors that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax. The emergency department was smaller than what Jake had seen in military hospitals, but it was organized with the same attention to efficiency and quick access. 12 beds separated by curtains, a central nursing station with monitors displaying patient vitals, and equipment carts positioned for immediate use. It felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and unnerving. "This is where you'll be spending most of your time," Dr. Ayu Torres explained, introducing Jake to the morning nursing staff. "We run 3 shifts, days, evenings, and nights. You'll start on days until you get comfortable with our protocols, then we'll discuss other options." Jake spent the first 4 hours in orientation, learning the hospital's computer system, reviewing protocols for different types of trauma cases, and familiarizing himself with equipment that was more advanced than anything he'd used in field hospitals. The technology was impressive, but Jake found himself mentally cataloging what was missing, the improvisational tools and techniques that had kept soldiers alive when proper equipment wasn't available. His first real case came at 11:30 a.m., a construction worker who'd fallen from scaffolding at a job site across town. Jake heard the ambulance sirens and felt his pulse quicken automatically, the sound triggering responses that had been programmed into him through repetition and necessity. "Trauma in Bay 3, announced Lisa Martinez, the charge nurse. "Construction accident, possible head injury and internal bleeding." Jake followed Dr. Chen into the trauma bay, his hands automatically checking that supplies were where they should be. The patient was a man in his 40s, hard hat cracked and coveralls torn, conscious but disoriented. His name was Pete Kowalski, and according to the paramedics, he'd fallen 20 feet onto concrete. "Pete, can you hear me?" "Doctor?" Chen asked, shining a light into the patient's eyes to check for signs of concussion. "I'm Dr. Chen, this is Jake. He's going to help take care of you." Jake's training took over, his hands moving to check pulse and blood pressure while his eyes assessed the patient for obvious injuries. Pete had a laceration across his scalp that was bleeding freely, possible broken ribs, and his abdomen was tender to the touch, a sign of potential internal bleeding. "BP is dropping," Jake reported, his voice calm and clinical. "Pulse is rapid and thready, probable internal bleeding." Dr. Chen nodded, ordering blood work and imaging studies. "Jake, can you get pressure on that scalp wound while we wait for radiology?" For the next hour, Jake worked alongside Dr. Chen and the nursing staff, monitoring Pete's condition and assisting with procedures. It was different from combat medicine, cleaner, more methodical, with access to equipment and specialists that field medics could only dream of. But the fundamental challenge was the same: keep the patient stable, assess and treat injuries, and buy time for the body to heal itself. Pete Kowalski survived his fall and was transferred to the regional medical center for surgery, to repair internal bleeding. As Jake watched the helicopter lift off from the hospital's landing pad, he felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and anxiety that followed successful trauma treatment. Another life saved, another family that wouldn't have to plan a funeral instead of a recovery. "Good work in there," Dr. Chen said, appearing beside him in the break room. "You have good instincts and your hands are steady. How did it feel?" Jake considered the question. "Different from what I'm used to, but not bad different. Cleaner, more controlled." "The chaos comes later," Dr. Chen said with a smile. "Wait until we have 3 trauma cases at once, or a multi-car accident on the interstate. Then you'll see how chaotic civilian medicine can get." The rest of Jake's shift passed with routine cases: a child with a broken arm from falling off a bicycle, an elderly man with chest pain that turned out to be heartburn, a teenager who'd cut her hand while working in her family's restaurant kitchen. Each case was an opportunity to practice civilian protocols and work with the hospital's team, building the kind of trust and communication that made emergency medicine possible. At 6 p.m., Jake signed out and headed to the parking lot, physically and emotionally drained in a way that felt familiar. Dr. Torres intercepted him at the exit. "How was your first day?" the emergency chief asked. "Busy," Jake replied, "but good busy if that makes sense." "Perfect sense," Dr. Torres said. "Jake, I want you to know that what you did today, the way you handled Pete's case, the way you worked with the team, that's exactly what we were hoping for when we offered you this position." Driving home, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months, the satisfaction of a day's work that had made a difference. Pete Kowalski was alive because a team of medical professionals had worked together to save his life, and Jake had been part of that team. It wasn't the same as military service, but it was service nonetheless. His mother was waiting with dinner and questions about his first day. Tom Morrison was having a difficult evening. The ALS symptoms were worse in the evenings, his speech more slurred and his movements more labored. But he listened intently as Jake described his cases, asking questions that showed he understood both the medical aspects and the emotional weight of the work. "Sounds like you belong there," Tom said finally, the words coming slowly but clearly. "Sounds like you found your place." That night, Jake slept better than he had since coming home. The dreams were still there. They probably always would be. But they were mixed now with images of Pete Kowalski walking out of the hospital, of families relieved rather than devastated, of skills used to heal rather than just to survive. It wasn't perfect, but it was a beginning. 3 weeks into his new position, Jake had settled into a routine that felt increasingly natural. He arrived at the hospital each morning at 6 a.m., spent 12 hours treating everything from minor injuries to serious trauma cases, and returned home to help his parents navigate the daily challenges of his father's declining health. It was exhausting and rewarding in equal measure, the kind of purposeful exhaustion that came from meaningful work. The test of his resolve came on a grey November morning when the emergency department's calm was shattered by multiple incoming trauma alerts. Jake was restocking supply carts when the first call came in. A head-on collision on Highway 30. Multiple casualties, first ambulance ETA 5 minutes. "All hands on deck," announced Dr. Torres over the intercom. "Multi-vehicle accident with at least 4 casualties. Prepare trauma bays 1 through 4. Jake felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the emergency department transformed into a coordinated response machine. Nurses checked equipment, doctors reviewed protocols, and support staff cleared beds and prepared for incoming patients. It was controlled chaos, the kind Jake remembered from combat hospitals when incoming helicopters brought wounded soldiers in waves. The first ambulance arrived with sirens wailing, carrying Maria Santos, a 34-year-old mother of 2 who'd been driving to work when a pickup truck crossed the center line. She was unconscious with obvious head trauma, her breathing shallow and irregular. "Bay 1, Dr. Chen called out, taking charge of Maria's case. "Jake, I need you with me." The next hour blurred into a stream of medical procedures and life-or-death decisions. Maria had suffered a severe concussion and internal bleeding, requiring immediate intervention to prevent brain swelling and stabilize her blood pressure. Jake worked alongside Dr. Chen with the efficiency born of shared crisis, anticipating needs and adjusting to changing conditions without conscious thought. "I need to intubate," Dr. Chen announced as Maria's breathing became more labored. "Jake, can you assist?" Jake's hands moved automatically, positioning Maria's head and providing the support Dr. Chen needed to insert the breathing tube. It was a procedure he'd performed dozens of times in field conditions, but never with equipment this sophisticated or in circumstances this controlled. The second ambulance brought in Robert Harrison, the driver of the pickup truck who'd caused the accident. He was conscious but had suffered severe chest trauma and a broken leg. The third ambulance carried Jessica and Timothy Chen, no relation to Dr. Chen, two teenagers who'd been passengers in Maria's car. Jessica had a broken collarbone and cuts from shattered glass. Timothy had suffered a punctured lung and was in serious but stable condition. For 2 hours, the emergency department operated at maximum capacity, with Jake moving between trauma bays as needed. His combat experience proved invaluable. He was accustomed to triaging multiple casualties, making rapid assessments, and maintaining focus while surrounded by controlled chaos. The critical moment came when Maria Santos went into cardiac arrest, while Dr. Chen was treating another patient. Jake was monitoring her vitals when the heart rhythm monitor flatlined, its alarm piercing through the controlled noise of the emergency department. "V-fib," Jake called out, recognizing the dangerous heart rhythm immediately. "I need a crash cart in Bay 1. Doctor." Torres appeared beside him within seconds, but Jake was already beginning chest compressions, his training taking over completely. "How long has she been down?" Dr. Torres asked, preparing the defibrillator. "Less than 30 seconds, Jake replied, maintaining steady chest compressions. "She was stable until just now." "On my mark," Dr. Torres said, charging the defibrillator. "Clear." Jake stepped back as the electric shock jolted through Maria's body, watching the monitor for signs of a normal heart rhythm. Nothing. Jake immediately resumed chest compressions, while Dr. Torres prepared for another shock. "Come on, Maria," Jake muttered under his breath, falling back on the habit of talking to unconscious patients that he'd developed in Afghanistan. "Your kids need you to fight. Stay with us." The second shock restored normal rhythm, and Maria's pulse returned strong and steady. Jake continued monitoring her vitals, while Dr. Torres ordered additional tests and treatments. It had been close. Another minute or two of cardiac arrest, and brain damage would have been inevitable. "Outstanding work," Dr. Torres said quietly, once Maria was stabilized. "Your quick recognition and response probably saved her life." By the end of the shift, all 4 accident victims had been either treated and released or transferred to larger hospitals for specialized care. Maria Santos was flown to the Regional Trauma Center for neurosurgery, but was expected to make a full recovery. The teenagers would heal completely from their injuries. Even Robert Harrison, despite being responsible for the accident, would survive his injuries and face the legal consequences of his actions. In the break room afterward, Jake sat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, processing what had happened. Dr. Chen joined him, looking as exhausted as Jake felt. "Rough day," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Good day," Jake corrected. "Everyone lived. In my book, that makes it a good day." Dr. Chen studied his face, noting the fatigue but also the sense of satisfaction that came from successful trauma treatment. "Jake, I have to ask, how are you handling all this? The stress, the pressure, the constant life and death decisions? It can't be easy, especially given your military experience." Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer. "It's different from combat medicine," he said finally. "Cleaner, more controlled, better equipment and support. But the fundamental challenge is the same. You do everything you can with the time and resources you have, and you hope it's enough. And if it's not enough, then you learn from it and do better next time," Jake replied. "You can't save everyone, but you can't let that stop you from trying to save the people you can." Dr. Chen nodded, recognizing the wisdom that came from hard experience. "The hospital board is meeting next week to review our emergency department's performance metrics. I'm going to recommend that we make your position permanent and consider expanding our trauma capabilities. What you did today, the way you handled multiple casualties, your quick thinking with Maria's cardiac arrest, that's exactly what rural hospitals need." That evening, Jake arrived home to find his father sitting in the kitchen, waiting for him with obvious effort. Tom Morrison's condition had worsened noticeably over the past few weeks, but he'd insisted on staying up to hear about Jake's day. "Heard on the scanner there was a big accident," Tom said, his words slow but clear. "So you were part of that?" Jake nodded, describing the day's events while his mother heated up dinner. Tom listened intently, asking questions that showed he understood both the medical complexities and the emotional weight of what Jake had experienced. "You saved lives today," Tom said when Jake finished his account. "Real lives, real families. That woman's children still have their mother because you knew what to do when it mattered. Dad, I was just doing my job. No, Tom Morrison said, reaching out to grasp his son's hand with fingers that trembled from disease, but held firm with paternal pride. You were doing what you were meant to do, using your gifts to help people who needed help. That's not just a job, son, that's a calling. Later that night, Jake stood on the front porch looking up at the November sky, clear and cold, with stars that seemed close enough to touch. 3 months ago, he'd been a lost veteran carrying invisible wounds and uncertain about his place in the world. Tonight, he was a trauma specialist who'd helped save 4 lives in a single shift, working alongside colleagues who valued his skills and trusted his judgment. The nightmares still came sometimes, memories of Afghanistan that would probably never completely fade. But they were balanced now by different images. Pete Kowalski walking out of the hospital, Maria Santos's heart rhythm returning to normal, the grateful tears of families who'd feared the worst and received better news than they'd dared to hope. Jake Morrison had found his way home, not to the place he'd left behind, but to the person he was meant to become. The boy who'd grown up on Elm Street was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned that sometimes the hardest battles were fought not with weapons, but with steady hands, quick thinking, and the determination to never give up on the people who needed saving. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emergencies, new opportunities to make a difference. Jake was ready for all of them. December brought the kind of bitter cold that turned Nebraska into a frozen landscape of endless white fields and skeletal trees. Jake had been working at Millbrook Medical Center for 2 months, settling into a routine that felt increasingly natural despite the emotional weight of the work. But it was during the 2nd week of December that everything changed, when the past and present collided in a way that threatened to undo all the progress he'd made. The call came in at 2:17 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. Motor vehicle accident on Interstate 80. Multiple casualties. Possible fatalities. Jake was reviewing patient charts when the familiar surge of adrenaline hit his system, his body automatically preparing for the controlled chaos of trauma medicine. But this time something felt different. The dispatcher's voice carried an edge of urgency that suggested this wasn't a routine accident. All available personnel to trauma bays, Dr. Torres announced over the intercom. Mass casualty event, ETA 4 minutes. This is not a drill. Jake joined the emergency response team gathering in the main trauma bay, but as the details came in over the radio, his hands began to shake in a way they hadn't since his first day. Military convoy transport, the paramedic reported. National Guard unit returning from training exercises. Truck rolled on black ice, ejected multiple personnel. At least 3 critical injuries, 1 DOA. The words hit Jake like physical blows. Military transport, multiple casualties, 1 dead on arrival. Suddenly, he wasn't standing in a civilian hospital in Nebraska. He was back in a field hospital in Kandahar, listening to radio reports about incoming casualties from an IED attack that had torn apart his unit. "Jake, you okay?" Dr. Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away, even though she was standing right beside him. Jake tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His breathing was becoming shallow and rapid, his vision tunneling, as the familiar symptoms of a panic attack began to overwhelm his nervous system. The sterile smell of the hospital transformed into the dust and cordite scent of Afghanistan. The sound of monitors and equipment became the distant thump of helicopter rotors and the screams of wounded soldiers. "I need some air," Jake managed to say, pushing past his colleagues and heading for the exit. He made it to the parking lot before the full force of the panic attack hit him, leaving him gasping for breath and struggling to distinguish between past and present. Dr. Chen found him 20 minutes later, sitting on a bench behind the hospital, with his head in his hands. The first ambulance had already arrived, carrying injured National Guard soldiers whose faces were too young and whose injuries were too familiar. Jake could hear the organized chaos of the emergency response inside, but he couldn't make himself go back in. "Jake," Dr. Chen said gently, sitting beside him on the bench. "Talk to me." "I can't do this," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could, but I can't. Not this. Not when it's soldiers." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, understanding more than Jake realized. "Is this about Afghanistan?" The question opened floodgates that Jake had been keeping sealed through willpower and professional focus. The story came out in fragments, Rodriguez bleeding out in his arms, the field amputation he'd performed on Private Chen while mortars fell around them. The 19-year-old kid from Ohio who'd begged Jake to tell his mother he was sorry before he died from wounds Jake couldn't fix. "I saved 12 soldiers that tour," Jake said, staring at his hands. "But I lost 6. 6 kids who died because I wasn't good enough, wasn't fast enough, wasn't trained enough to keep them alive." "Jake, listen to me," Dr. Chen said firmly. "You can't save everyone. No one can. The soldiers who lived, they lived because you were there. The ones who died, they died because war is hell, not because you failed them." Inside the hospital, the emergency response was handling the National Guard casualties with the efficiency Jake had helped build over the past 2 months. 3 soldiers were treated and released with minor injuries. 2 were stabilized and transferred to larger hospitals for specialized care. The one who died on arrival had been killed instantly in the accident. Nothing any medical professional could have done would have changed that outcome. But Jake couldn't stop seeing Rodriguez's face in the young soldiers being wheeled through the emergency department. Couldn't stop hearing the voices of the wounded calling for medics, calling for their mothers, calling for help that sometimes came too late, despite everyone's best efforts. "I can't go back in there today," Jake told Dr. Chen as the last ambulance pulled away from the hospital. "I'm sorry. I know you need me, but I just can't." "Doctor." Chen studied Jake's face, seeing the toll that the afternoon's events had taken on him. "Take the rest of the week off," she said. "Get some help. Talk to someone who understands what you're going through. When you're ready to come back, we'll be here." The drive home was a blur of snowy roads and racing thoughts. Jake's hands were still shaking when he pulled into his parents' driveway, and he sat in the car for several minutes, trying to compose himself before going inside. But Susan Morrison had developed a mother's sixth sense about her son's emotional state, and she took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" she asked immediately. Jake told her about the National Guard accident, about the panic attack, about the memories that had crashed through his carefully constructed defenses, like a dam breaking under pressure. Susan listened without judgment, her hand resting on his shoulder in the kind of comfort that only a mother could provide. "Maybe I was fooling myself," Jake said finally. "Maybe I'm not ready for this kind of work. Maybe I'll never be ready." Tom Morrison had been listening from his chair in the living room, and now he spoke up with the clear voice he managed sometimes when the message was important enough. "Son, come sit with me." Jake joined his father, noting how much Tom had declined even in the past few weeks. The ALS was progressing relentlessly, stealing mobility and strength with each passing day. But Tom's eyes were still sharp, still full of the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of facing difficult challenges. "You know what courage is?" Tom asked. Jake shrugged. "Not being afraid." "No," Tom said, shaking his head slowly. "Courage is being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. Courage is falling down and getting back up. Courage is carrying scars and still choosing to help people." Tom reached out with a trembling hand and touched the spot over Jake's heart. "You've got good reasons to be scared, son. You've seen things, lost people, carried burdens that would break most men. But you're still here. You're still trying to help. That's not failure. That's courage. Dad, I don't know if I can go back." "You don't have to know," Tom replied. "You just have to be willing to try. One day at a time, one patient at a time, one choice at a time. That's how healing works, for the people you treat and for yourself." That night, Jake called the Veterans Affairs Crisis Line, something he'd avoided doing since returning from Afghanistan. The counselor he spoke with was a former Navy corpsman who'd served in Iraq, someone who understood the specific challenges of military medical personnel dealing with trauma and loss. "The thing about being a combat medic," the counselor said, "is that your success is measured in lives saved, but your failures are measured in lives lost. That's an impossible standard to maintain without support." They talked for an hour about PTSD, about survivor guilt, about the challenge of transitioning from military to civilian healthcare. The counselor recommended a support group for veteran healthcare workers and gave Jake information about therapy options that specialized in military trauma. "The work you're doing at that hospital," the counselor said before they ended the call, "that's not separate from your military service, that's a continuation of it. You're still saving lives, still serving others, still being the person you trained to be. The location changed, but the mission is the same." 3 days later, Jake returned to Millbrook Medical Center. still carrying the weight of his memories but with a better understanding of how to manage them. Dr. Torres and Dr. Chen were waiting for him with support rather than judgment, understanding that healing was a process rather than a destination. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Torres asked. "Scared," Jake admitted, but ready to try again. The afternoon brought a routine case, an elderly farmer who'd cut his hand on a piece of equipment, but Jake approached it with renewed perspective. Every patient was someone's son or daughter, someone's parent or grandparent, someone whose life mattered to the people who loved them. It wasn't about being perfect or saving everyone. It was about showing up, doing your best, and accepting that sometimes your best was enough, and sometimes it wasn't. As Jake cleaned and sutured the farmer's wound, he thought about Rodriguez and all the soldiers he'd treated in Afghanistan. They would want him to keep going, to keep using his skills to help people, to keep fighting the good fight in whatever form it took. The memories would always be there, but they didn't have to define his future. They could inform it, guide it, make him a better healer because of what he'd learned in the worst of circumstances. When his shift ended, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months: peace with his choice to return to medical work, acceptance of both his abilities and his limitations, and hope that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to make a difference in someone's life. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that transformed Millbrook into a picture postcard version of small-town America. Jake had been back at work for 2 weeks, finding his rhythm again with the support of his colleagues and the structured therapy sessions he'd begun attending in Lincoln. The panic attack had been a setback, but it had also been a breakthrough, forcing him to confront the trauma he'd been carrying and find healthier ways to process it. He was finishing his evening shift when Dr. Chen approached with news that would change his perspective on his role at the hospital. "Jake, there's someone here who wants to meet you," she said, gesturing toward the family waiting area. "Maria Santos, the woman from the car accident last month. She's here with her family." Jake felt his chest tighten with familiar anxiety. Patient visits could go either way. Sometimes they were expressions of gratitude, sometimes they were confrontations about perceived failures in care. But Dr. Chen's expression was encouraging, so Jake followed her to the waiting area, where a woman in her mid-30s sat with 2 young children and an older man who was probably her father. Maria Santos looked remarkably well for someone who'd suffered severe head trauma and cardiac arrest just 6 weeks earlier. Her hair had grown back over the surgical site, and while she moved carefully, she was clearly on the path to full recovery. When she saw Jake approaching, her face lit up with a smile that transformed her features. "You're Jake," she said, standing to greet him. "Dr. Chen told me you were the one who saved my life when my heart stopped." Jake felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I was just doing my job, Mrs. Santos. Dr. Torres and Dr. Chen did the real work." "Maybe," Maria replied, "but you're the one who was there when it mattered most. These are my children, Sophia and Miguel." She gestured to 2 kids who looked to be about 8 and 10 years old. They wanted to meet the man who helped make sure their mama could come home for Christmas. Sophia, the younger child, stepped forward with the serious expression that children wear when they're trying to say something important. "Thank you for fixing our mom," she said solemnly. "We were really scared she was going to die." The words hit Jake harder than he'd expected. He knelt down to Sophia's eye level, seeing in her face all the children who'd lost parents in Afghanistan, all the families torn apart by violence and circumstance beyond their control. But this time, the story had a different ending. "Your mom is very strong," Jake told Sophia. "She fought really hard to get better so she could come home to you." Miguel, the older boy, was studying Jake with the analytical gaze of a child trying to figure out how adults fit into his world. "Are you a doctor?" he asked. "Not exactly," Jake replied. "I'm what they call a trauma specialist. I help doctors take care of people who get hurt in accidents." "Like a superhero?" Sophia asked, with the logic that only children possessed. Jake laughed, the first genuine laugh he'd had in weeks. "Not quite. More like a helper who knows how to fix things when people get hurt." Maria's father, who'd been quietly observing the interaction, stepped forward and extended his hand. "Carlos Santos," he said in accented English, "Maria's father. I want to thank you for what you did. When we got the call about the accident," he paused, emotion making it difficult to continue. "We thought we'd lost her. The doctors said if her heart had been stopped much longer, there would have been brain damage." Jake shook the older man's hand, feeling the calluses of someone who'd worked with his hands his entire life. "How is she doing now?" Good days and bad days, Maria answered for herself. Some headaches, some memory issues, but the doctors say that's normal. I'm back to work part-time and I can drive again. Most importantly, I can take care of my kids. They talked for another 15 minutes, with Maria describing her recovery process and the children chattering about Christmas plans and school activities. When they finally prepared to leave, Sophia ran back to Jake and hugged his legs with the enthusiasm that only children could manage. "Are you going to be here if we need you again?" she asked, looking up at him with complete trust. "I'll be here," Jake promised, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. After the Santos family left, Jake found himself sitting alone in the break room, processing the encounter. Dr. Chen joined him a few minutes later, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the machine that dispensed liquid that was technically coffee, but barely qualified as such. "That was good for you to see," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Sometimes we get so focused on the medical aspects of what we do that we forget about the human side, the families, the futures, the lives that continue because of the work we do." Jake nodded, thinking about Sophia's question about superheroes. "I never thought of it that way before. In the military, you treat the wounded and send them back to duty or back home. You don't usually see what happens next, how they rebuild their lives." "That's one of the advantages of civilian medicine," Dr. Chen replied. "You get to see the whole story, the trauma, the treatment, the recovery, and the life that follows." Maria Santos is going to watch her children graduate from high school and college. She's going to dance at their weddings and hold her grandchildren, all because you knew what to do when her heart stopped. The conversation was interrupted by Jake's phone buzzing with a text message from his mother. "Dad wants to talk to you when you get home. Good day today." Jake had learned to read the codes in his mother's messages. Good day meant Tom Morrison was having less difficulty with speech and movement, the unpredictable reprieve that ALS sometimes granted before taking more ground. These good days were becoming rarer, making them more precious. When Jake arrived home, he found his father sitting in the kitchen, a cup of coffee growing cold in his trembling hands. Tom looked up when Jake entered, and his smile was the same one Jake remembered from childhood, proud, loving, and somehow reassuring, even in the face of an incurable disease. "How was work?" Tom asked, his words clearer than they'd been in days. Jake told him about Maria Santos's visit, about Sophia's hug and Miguel's questions about superheroes. Tom listened intently, nodding at appropriate moments, and asking questions that showed he understood both the medical and emotional significance of the encounter. "You know what I'm proudest of," Tom said when Jake finished his story. "Not that you saved that woman's life, though that's something to be proud of. I'm proud that you came back from the war broken and found a way to put yourself back together. I'm proud that you took the hardest parts of your experience and found a way to use them to help other people." Tom paused, gathering strength for what he wanted to say next. "When I was diagnosed with ALS, I was angry. Angry at God, angry at fate, angry at my body for betraying me. But watching you these past few months, seeing how you found your purpose again, that's helped me understand something important." "What's that, Dad?" "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do for others. Your war experience was terrible, but it gave you skills that saved Maria Santos's life. My disease is terrible, but it's helped me understand how precious time is, how important it is to tell the people you love how proud you are of them." Tom reached across the table and grasped Jake's hand with fingers that shook but held firm with paternal love. "I'm proud of the man you've become, son. Not the soldier you were or the medic you trained to be, but the person you chose to be when you came home. That's the real measure of a man, not what happens to him, but what he does with what happens to him." That night, Jake stood on the front porch, looking up at the clear December sky, stars brilliant in the cold air above Millbrook. 3 months ago, he'd been a broken veteran struggling with invisible wounds and uncertain about his place in the world. Tonight, he was a trauma specialist who'd found a way to transform his worst experiences into something that could help others. The nightmares still came sometimes, they probably always would, but they were balanced now by different dreams. Sophia Santos hugging his legs and calling him a superhero, Maria Santos dancing at her children's weddings, all the families who would remain whole because someone with the right training had been in the right place at the right time. Jake Morrison had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that trauma hadn't happened. Healing was about finding a way to honor the experience, to use the knowledge gained through suffering, to prevent others from suffering, to transform wounds into wisdom and pain into purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emergencies, new opportunities to make a difference. Jake was ready for all of them, not because the past no longer hurt, but because he'd learned that sometimes the things that hurt us most also prepare us to help others in ways we never could have imagined. January brought the kind of bitter cold that made Nebraska feel like the edge of the world, but inside the Morrison house on Elm Street, there was warmth that had nothing to do with the furnace working overtime. Jake had been home for 4 months now, working at the hospital for 3, and the rhythm of their daily life had settled into something that felt both fragile and precious. Tom Morrison's condition had worsened significantly over the holidays. The ALS had progressed to the point where he needed assistance with most basic tasks. His speech had become increasingly difficult to understand, and his mobility was limited to short walks with a walker. But his mind remained sharp, and on his better days, he still dispensed the kind of paternal wisdom that had shaped Jake's character from childhood. It was on one of these better days that Tom made an announcement that would change everything. "I want to visit the hospital," Tom said over breakfast, his words slow but clear. "I want to see where Jake works." Susan Morrison looked up from her coffee with concern. "Tom, honey, you're not really up for that kind of trip. It's cold outside and—" "I'm dying, Susan," Tom interrupted gently. "We all know it, but I'm not dead yet, and I want to see my son saving lives before I go." The directness of the statement hung in the air like a challenge. Tom Morrison had never been one to dance around difficult truths, and his illness hadn't changed that aspect of his personality. If anything, the proximity of death had made him more determined to speak plainly about things that mattered. Jake set down his coffee cup and studied his father's face. "Dad, are you sure about this? It's not exactly a cheerful place." "Son," Tom replied with a slight smile, "I've been watching you these past few months, seeing how you found your purpose again. I raised you to be the kind of man who helps people when they need help. I want to see that man at work." 2 hours later, Jake was pushing his father's wheelchair through the corridors of Millbrook Medical Center, feeling oddly nervous about showing Tom his workplace. It was one thing to describe his cases at the dinner table. It was another to have his father witness firsthand the environment where Jake had rebuilt his sense of purpose. Dr. Torres met them at the emergency department entrance, having been briefed by Jake about the visit. "Mr. Morrison," he said, extending his hand to Tom, "it's an honor to meet you. Your son is one of the best trauma specialists we've ever had." Tom shook the doctor's hand with effort, his grip weak but determined. "He gets that from his mother," he said with characteristic humor. "I just taught him how to use tools." Dr. Torres gave them a tour of the emergency department, explaining the equipment and procedures, while Tom listened intently and asked surprisingly sophisticated questions. Jake realized that his father had been paying closer attention to his work stories than he'd realized, absorbing details and understanding the complexity of emergency medicine. They were in the middle of the tour when the familiar sound of sirens announced incoming trauma. Jake's body automatically tensed, his training taking over as he prepared to respond to whatever emergency was arriving. "Multi-vehicle accident on Highway 30, the radio crackled. 3 casualties incoming. ETA, 2 minutes. Dr. Torres looked at Tom Morrison, then at Jake. "Would you like to observe from the family waiting area? You can see the trauma bay through the windows." Tom nodded, and Jake positioned his father's wheelchair where he could watch the emergency response unfold. The first ambulance arrived with a family of 3, parents and a teenage daughter, who'd been involved in a collision with a drunk driver. The parents had minor injuries, but the daughter had suffered a head injury and was unconscious. Jake moved into action with the fluid efficiency that had become second nature, working alongside Dr. Chen to assess and stabilize the teenage patient. Tom Morrison watched from his wheelchair as his son demonstrated the skills that had been forged in the crucible of combat and refined through months of civilian practice. The girl, her name was Ashley Peterson, and she was 16 years old, had suffered a concussion and some internal bleeding, but Jake's quick assessment and treatment stabilized her condition until she could be transferred to a larger hospital for specialized care. Her parents, despite their own injuries, stayed by her side throughout the process, their love and fear evident in every gesture. When the excitement died down and Ashley had been transferred, Jake returned to his father with a mixture of professional satisfaction and emotional exhaustion. Tom Morrison was sitting quietly in his wheelchair, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Dad," "What's wrong?" Jake asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing's wrong," Tom replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Everything's right. That girl is going to be okay because you knew what to do. Her parents are going to take her home instead of planning a funeral because my son was here to help." Tom reached out and grasped Jake's hand with both of his own, trembling fingers holding on with surprising strength. "I've been proud of you your whole life, son. When you scored touchdowns, when you graduated high school, when you enlisted in the Marines. But I've never been prouder than I am right now, watching you save that child's life." The emotion in his father's voice broke through Jake's professional composure. He knelt beside the wheelchair, and for a moment they were just a father and son facing the reality that their time together was limited, but not wasted. "I learned it from you, Dad," Jake said quietly. "The idea that a man's job is to help people when they need help. That's what you taught me." "No," Tom replied, shaking his head slowly. "I taught you to use tools and fix things that were broken. You learned to fix people. That's something bigger than anything I ever did." The visit to the hospital became a turning point in Tom Morrison's final months. He began talking more openly about his legacy, about the things he wanted Jake to remember and carry forward. These conversations often took place in the evenings, when Tom's symptoms were worse, but his determination to communicate was stronger. "Promise me something," Tom said one night in late January, his words requiring effort, but carrying unmistakable authority. "Promise me you won't let the war define you. You found something good to do with what you learned there. Don't let anyone tell you that your service was for nothing." Jake promised, understanding that his father was giving him permission to be proud of his military service while still acknowledging its cost. It was a gift that would sustain him through the difficult months ahead. Tom Morrison died on a Tuesday morning in February, peacefully in his sleep with Susan and Jake beside him. His passing was quiet and dignified, the kind of death that ALS rarely granted, but that seemed fitting for a man who'd lived his life with integrity and purpose. The funeral filled Millbrook's Methodist Church to capacity, with people coming from across the county to pay respects to a man who'd built half the town's buildings and raised a son who'd grown up to save lives. Jake delivered the eulogy, speaking about his father's belief that a man's worth was measured by how he helped others, and how that lesson had guided Jake's own journey from war to healing. After the service, Jake stood beside his father's grave in the small cemetery behind the church, processing the reality that the man who'd shaped his character was gone. Dr. Chen appeared beside him, having attended the funeral along with several other hospital staff members. "He was proud of you," she said simply. "Anyone could see that." "He taught me that broken things could be fixed," Jake replied. "I just had to figure out how to apply that to people instead of machinery." "And now you're teaching others," Dr. Chen said. "The new trauma protocols you've helped develop, the training sessions you've been running for our nursing staff, that's Tom Morrison's legacy continuing through his son." Jake hadn't thought of his work in those terms, but he realized Dr. Chen was right. The skills his father had taught him about fixing things, combined with the medical training he'd received in the military, had created something new and valuable. He was not just treating patients, he was building systems and training people to save lives more effectively. "The hospital board approved the expansion of our trauma program," Dr. Chen continued. "We're going to be hiring 2 more trauma specialists and upgrading our equipment. They want you to head the program." The offer was both an honor and a responsibility that felt overwhelming. Leading a trauma program meant making decisions that would affect not just individual patients, but the entire medical response capability of their region. It meant taking the knowledge he'd gained through loss and suffering and using it to build something that would outlast his own career. "Can I think about it?" Jake asked. "Of course," Dr. Chen replied. "But Jake, your father would want you to say yes. This is how legacies work. You take what you've learned and you pass it on to others who can use it to help even more people." That night, Jake sat in his childhood bedroom, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. High school trophies, military commendations, photographs of friends who'd survived the war and friends who hadn't. Tomorrow he would begin the process of creating something new, something that honored both his father's memory and his own journey from broken veteran to healer. Tom Morrison was gone, but his belief that broken things could be fixed lived on in his son's hands and heart. Jake would carry that forward, one patient at a time, one life at a time, building a legacy of healing that would extend far beyond his own story. 6 months later, Jake Morrison stood in the newly renovated trauma center at Millbrook Medical Center, watching the final pieces of equipment being installed. The expansion had taken longer than expected, but the result exceeded everyone's hopes. State-of-the-art monitors, advanced surgical equipment, and a training simulation center that would serve not just their hospital, but the entire region. The Jake Morrison who'd stepped off that Greyhound bus 8 months earlier would barely recognize the man he'd become. The trauma program he now directed served 5 counties, training emergency responders and medical personnel in techniques that had been refined through his unique combination of combat experience and civilian practice. More importantly, it was saving lives at a rate that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. "The dedication ceremony starts in an hour," Dr. Torres said, joining Jake in the main trauma bay. "You ready for this?" Jake adjusted his tie, still uncomfortable with the formal clothes that came with his new administrative responsibilities. "As ready as I'll ever be. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real." The ceremony was scheduled to dedicate the trauma center in memory of Tom Morrison, a gesture that the hospital board had insisted upon after learning about the man who'd raised their star trauma specialist. Jake had initially resisted the idea, but his mother had convinced him that Tom would have been honored to have his name associated with a facility dedicated to helping others. "Your father would be so proud," Susan Morrison said, joining them in the trauma bay. She looked elegant in her navy blue dress, her hair newly styled for the occasion. Grief had aged her over the past few months, but there was also a lightness in her expression that spoke of acceptance and hope for the future. The ceremony drew people from across the state. Maria Santos came with her children, Sofia and Miguel, both of whom had grown noticeably in the months since Jake had first met them. Ashley Peterson, the teenage girl whose life Jake had saved during his father's hospital visit, attended with her parents. Dozens of patients and their families filled the hospital's main conference room, living testimony to the work being done in the new facility. Dr. Sarah Chen served as the master of ceremonies, speaking about the transformation of emergency medicine in rural Nebraska and the role that Jake's leadership had played in that change. When she called Jake to the podium, he felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that always preceded public speaking. 8 months ago, I came home from Afghanistan, carrying wounds that weren't visible but were very real, Jake began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I thought my military service had broken me beyond repair. I was wrong about that, but it took time and help from many people to understand how wrong I was." He paused, scanning the audience and seeing faces that represented his journey from broken veteran to healer. "My father, Tom Morrison, taught me that broken things could be fixed if you had the right tools and the determination to use them. The military gave me tools I never wanted to need. This hospital gave me the opportunity to use those tools to help people, instead of just surviving myself." Jake's voice grew stronger as he continued. "This trauma center isn't just about advanced equipment or improved protocols. It's about the idea that our worst experiences can become the foundation for our best service to others. Every person who'll be treated here, every life that'll be saved here, is proof that healing is possible, for patients and for the people who care for them." When Jake finished speaking, the applause was warm and sustained. But the moment that meant the most came when Sofia Santos ran up to the podium and hugged his legs, just as she had on that Christmas Eve when her family had come to thank him. "Are you still a superhero?" she asked, looking up at him with the serious expression that children wore when asking important questions. Jake knelt down to her level, seeing in her face all the reasons why the work mattered. "I'm just someone who learned how to fix things when they're broken," he said. "But if that makes me a superhero to you, then I guess that's what I am." After the ceremony, Jake found himself in the hospital's meditation garden, a small outdoor space that had been created for families and staff who needed a quiet place to process difficult emotions. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the maple trees were beginning their annual transformation into brilliant shades of gold and red. Dr. Chen joined him on the bench, both of them watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in shades of orange and pink. "So what's next for Jake Morrison?" she asked. Jake considered the question. The trauma center was operational. His therapy sessions had helped him develop better coping strategies for his PTSD, and his mother was adjusting well to life without his father. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. I've been thinking about expanding the program, Jake said, training other veterans with medical backgrounds, helping them transition from military to civilian healthcare. There are a lot of people out there with skills like mine who just need the right opportunity to use them. That sounds like something Tom Morrison would approve of, Dr. Chen observed. Jake smiled, thinking about his father's belief that broken things could be fixed. Yeah, I think he would. He always said that helping people was the best use of whatever abilities you had. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting behind the cornfields that surrounded Millbrook. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emergencies, new opportunities to make a difference in someone's life. Jake Morrison was ready for all of them. The boy who'd left Millbrook as a high school football hero was gone, replaced by a man who'd learned that true heroism wasn't about glory or recognition. It was about showing up when people needed help, using whatever skills you had to make their situation better, and understanding that sometimes the hardest battles were fought with steady hands, quick thinking, and the determination never to give up on the people who needed saving. Jake Morrison had found his way home, not to the place he'd left behind, but to the person he was meant to become. The nightmares still came sometimes. They probably always would. But they were balanced now by dreams of families like the Santos family, whole and grateful, and looking forward to futures that wouldn't have existed without the right person being in the right place at the right time. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. The trauma center's automatic doors slid open as Jake walked back inside, ready for whatever the night shift would bring. Behind him, the last light of day faded over the Nebraska plains, and ahead of him the endless possibility of making a difference in someone's life stretched out like a promise that he intended to keep. Jake Morrison, combat veteran, trauma specialist, and healer of both bodies and spirits, was exactly where he belonged.